Good afternoon and good evening, everyone. Welcome to this amazing Saturday, December 12th, here with the SSB and all of our friends watching us live right now. We welcome everyone. We would like to also welcome those who will be watching this in the future. Tonight, one more amazing presentation that we come together to work together to share a moment of our lives together, always learning, always enlightening our lives together. Tonight, we have our dear friend Fred Gouveia with us. But before we pass the word to Fred, let us take a moment to read a passage of the book Happy Life, as well as pray together so we can acclimate ourselves to this moment and to introduce ourselves to the speaker of this afternoon, to this evening, as well as the title and the topic that we'll be discussing tonight. In the book Happy Life by the Spirit Joana de Angelis, through the hands of the medium Divaldo Pereira Franco, she says the following: contain your impulses, which arise from uncontrolled instincts, and act under the command of reason. It is true that good feelings can melt the ice of rational logic. However, it is often the case that the coldness of emotion, or its aggressive madness, requires the vigilance of reason. Head and heart must act together, providing the advantages of balance and measure to create a healthy life. Listen with your feelings and act with your reason, keeping the two in just the right proportion. This way, with this amazing message and reminder from Joana de Angelis, let us pray together. You may wish to close your eyes, but we ask that you find a comfortable position, a position that will be able to maintain throughout this entire presentation, so we can be attentive, so we can connect with the speaker, with the topic, the teachings, and the reminders that we were about to receive. Dear Father, Mother God, we ask you that you guide us this evening, enlighten our hearts and our minds, enlighten the heart and mind of our presenter tonight. May these teachings pave the way for us to be more courageous, more secure with ourselves, not only leading us into a brighter future, but others as well. As we change our current behaviors to better ones, as we become more positive towards our future, as we act according to the amazing laws that you have created in the universe. And we also pray for those who may not have a moment, a treasure like this that we have for this following hour and a half. May them receive also these teachings, perhaps through our actions, through our thoughts, through the environment that we create around us. With your guidance, protection, and permission, we open this evening with our hearts full of joy for having one another, for having this moment, this channel of enlightenment in our lives. And so be it. As we were saying, we are happy to have Fred Gouveia here with us, and he will be speaking about Judas, regret, self-forgiveness, and redemption. Usually, as usual, we'd like to introduce our speakers, those who we invite to the SSB, with our hearts full of joy by saying that they are a friend, someone just like us, who is struggling like us, working their professional lives, whichever way, with their family members, friends, and everything. People just like us that have learned through Spiritism and would like to share the teachings and perhaps considerations that we don't know. And it's an amazing topic to talk about Judas, right? But Fred Gouveia is also a musician based in New York. He started his Spiritist Reflections recently, a YouTube channel that interviews people from all walks of life about their spiritual and personal journey. Perhaps you may have seen him playing, speaking, and doing multiple things, enlighten us. And tonight we already reminded him, you have to play. So Once more, to make this official, Judas, regret, self-forgiveness, and redemption. Fred, please enlighten us. Thank you.
Big hug, Leo. Big friend. Miss you, buddy. Good to be around you. And SS Baltimore, everybody, friends, make this peace, this beautiful moment, Saturday afternoon, arrive at all of your homes through this transmission, and that we may warm up our hearts around these reflections that I invite that we do together, that you interact by asking your questions in the comments here. I'm able to see it on the camera. And this reflection on Judas is basically something, aspects of about our own personality that we can reflect within and see how this character, who has been pretty much for the majority of the time labeled as the enemy or the traitor, there are more layers to him. There are deeper layers to him. And those layers are very much reflections of us. And the beauty of having the information that was brought to us through the mediumship of Chico Xavier about this spirit, his many journeys after this particular one in the gospel that we know, and the other angles of the story that were not told in the traditional gospels, bring us a bit bigger dimension of this character that we can empathize with and be able to also use his example as a source of strength for us. So I'm going to ask my friends if they could make yeah, perfect. Less me, more the content is better. So you're going to, if you have never learned about Judas, beyond what we see in the Gospels, this will be a really fascinating insight that we know thanks to Spiritism, what happens to him afterwards. So let's get right to it. For those that are not familiar with this particular narrative, it's found in the book Boa Nova, Good News, which was written in the year 1940 and was channeled to Chico Xavier by the spirit Humberto de Campos. And what's really puzzling and remarkable is that 3 months after he passed away, he presented himself in spirit to Emmanuel and to Chico, saying that he was ready to begin the task of transmitting several messages through books, through chronics and letters that he did through Chico. And he wrote 15 books altogether, which is actually more books than André Luiz wrote. So his contribution to the revelations we find in Spiritism is extraordinary. And particularly this book, Good News, which takes several chapters from key passages of the story of the gospel, and he amplifies it to us. He almost brings us the backstage, the behind the scenes, what was happening that morning when the disciples were walking. And then Jesus turns to the fig tree and curses the fig tree. We understand a much broader context. He takes us into the journey of Mary Magdalene in this book. He takes us to what was happening on the day that he preached the Sermon of the Mountain, the dynamic that was happening between the apostles, the arguments, Joanna of Cusa. And each chapter is truly fascinating. And one of them is this one, Judas, which is chapter 24, called The Illusion of the Apostle. So what we're going to do today is I'm going to read passages of how Humberto de Campos tells the story of Judas, the context. And then afterwards, we're going to go into the future of Judas from that time and see what happened afterwards. And we're going to see this process that we all go through, which is the realization of something that our conscience tells us that was not right. So we experience that whoops, that big whoops. And then we immediately go into a process of self-forgiveness and at the same time rebuilding, repairing, the renewal process. And finally, the redemption, liberation, when we finalize, we harmonize and completely dissolve whatever it was that we had done wrong by repairing it. So we're going to start with this chapter 24 of the book, The Good News, and it's called The Apostles' Illusions. And the way I'm going to read it, I'm going to make an effort not to read in a very boring way. So I'm going to be kind of paraphrasing so that we get the gist of it. So the story in chapter 24 begins in this scene, which is Palm Sunday, which is the Sunday that Jesus enters Jerusalem, the week of his crucifixion. So this is the Sunday before the Friday of his crucifixion. And you can tell in this scene that the entire crowd greets him with ecstasy, with euphoria, with this feverish enthusiasm that's almost crazy. And you can tell in this painting that the eyes of Jesus look very distant, very detached, very serene. And I'm bringing this painting because you'll see that the narrative actually mentions this scene that the apostles were witnessing on that Sunday afternoon as Jesus was entering Jerusalem and was greeted like a king. So it starts like this. Jesus arrives in Jerusalem where he was greeted with a shower of flowers. In the afternoon, after the consecration, then James and Judah began to walk side by side on an old road lined by olive trees that would take them to the humble and happy homes of Bethlehem. So after this public consecration, Judas and James, they go out of the city and they begin to walk together on this path. And they start a conversation. Now, Umberto gives us right away the scene of the emotional mental state of Judas and contrasts it to the emotional mental state of James. He begins by saying that the face of Judas showed a lot of unrest, while the serene gaze of James flared the soft and mild light that consoles the faithful souls. So one was angry, was disturbed, was very troubled with anguishment, and the other was calm. So Judas turns to James and said, James, don't you think that the master is too humble and too good to break the tyrannical subjugation that weighs upon Israel and its people? And then James replies by saying, well, would you envision that the master would be having destructive predispositions like a worldly warrior? And then Judas says, well, no, not quite, but I have the impression that the Messiah doesn't really consider the opportunities. Then he says, today, some religious scholars drew my attention, and they made me feel the futility of always preaching this gospel to the most ignorant and unqualified people. He says the needs of our people require a forceful and bold leader. So Judas was feeling a little bit embarrassed that it was kind of a useless effort to only bring this gospel to the poor, to the unqualified. He wanted this gospel to reach also the powerful, the wealthy. So James is listening to this and he says, well, Israel has always had revolutionary leaders, but the Messiah comes to perform a true revolution, which is to build a kingdom within hearts and souls. I can only imagine the way James was saying this, the level of inspiration. Judas, when he listens to this, he smiles with irony. And then he adds, can we expect such a change without drawing the interest and the attention of those that are powerful? So in his mind, can this external change in the world happen through the gospel if we're not reaching out to the ones that have the biggest power in the world? And James listens to that and he says, well, who is more powerful than God, of whom the master is the divine envoy? A good point, right? We don't realize that God is more powerful many times because we don't see God, but we see the world, the news, the Twitter pages, and we attribute more power to those. But James very wisely reminds us. And so Judas bites his lip when he listens to that. And then he continues, I don't agree with the principles of inaction. And I believe the gospel can only prevail with the patronage of Caesar's representatives or the administrative authorities in Jerusalem that determine our destiny. So you see, he wanted Rome and the doctors of the law in the Sanhedrin, which were the ones in charge of the spiritual and religious destiny of the Jewish people. He wanted those two institutions to receive the gospel. And remember, friends, Judas came from an area in Israel called Iscariot, which is in the south. He was a merchant. He was a businessman. He was dealing with commerce, unlike the majority of the other apostles who came from the region of Galilee and were fishermen, were more connected with nature, and in that way had different outlooks in the way they dealt with the business world and with the rich and powerful. So he says, following the master in his preachings in all of these cities like Caesarea, Sebastian, Chorazin, Bethsaida, while being absent from Capernaum was the main place that they used to preach, I have never seen in all of these places that I went with him, I really never saw him interested in gaining the attention of the upper classes. It's true that truth and love flowed from his divine lips wherever he went. He acknowledges them. But I've only seen the lepers and the blind, the poor and the illiterate approaching near our spring. So he has a valid question as a man who reasons and is trying to come to terms with the love that he has for the gospel. He's trying to understand, but why is it that only the poor, the blind, the illiterate, the ones with lepers are coming to the gospel? So James listens to this and says, well, Jesus has explained to us that his kingdom is not of this world. Beautiful answer. But then here's how we were able to penetrate the emotional state of Judas through the narrative of Humberto de Campos. Humberto says, with an odd spark in his uneasy eyes, the impatient apostle replied forcefully. Impatient apostle. This is a note to ourselves, to our emotional states, how impatience sometimes can get us into a lot of trouble. Right? And he says, we saw today how the people of Jerusalem covered the Lord's path with palms due to their admiration and their affection. We need to impose, however, the figure of the Messiah on the authorities of the provincial court and the temple so that we can take advantage of this outpouring of affection from the crowd. And he says Jesus was receiving all these tributes from the public without really taking part in the feverish enthusiasm of those who were surrounding him. And that's why we bring back this painting, where you can tell his eyes are detached. And he says this is the reason why we need to multiply the efforts in his place, so that our position of superiority will be recognized in proper time. So the Apostle Judas is displaying an attitude of impatience. He's not seeing the results he wants in the speed that he wants to see them. And he's not seeing the people that he admires, that he holds to a higher degree of admiration and respect, the rich and powerful. He's not seeing those people becoming converted by the idea of the gospel the way he had become. And he wants to find a way to get this message over to them. And then he sees, we want our position of superiority to be recognized in the proper time. So we see also an undercurrent of desire for power himself, right? He says, I observed, however, that the master had asserted once. James listens to all this and he says, well, didn't the master assert once that the greatest in the community will be the one that makes himself or herself the smallest? So the one that is there in selfless service, just doing the heartfelt work that calls him in that day on behalf of himself and other people, regardless of big outcomes or big changes and external praise, right? And Judas is listening to this analogy that he says from Jesus about the biggest in the community is the one who's actually makes himself the smallest, reduces the ego, gets the ego out of the picture. And Judas just responds to that by saying, we can't abide with such excess of theory. This is just too much theory for my taste. He says, today I'm going to be questioned by affluent friends from Jerusalem's political circles, and I will do everything possible to establish agreements with the senior officials and important men in order to develop a new movement towards the Messiah's teachings. So he was decided, he was committed that at that afternoon he was going to go out there and do agreements in order to establish the foundations of a new movement so that the Messiah can begin preaching to the rich, the famous, the powerful, and in his opinion, get those people to also pay attention. Not just the poor, the illiterate, the sick, the ones that he was noticing were the majority of the people that were really taking in the gospel message. As James is listening to this, a red flag goes up in his mind and he goes, Judas, Judas, be careful with what you do. Would it not the use of transitory powers of this world without justification be disrespectful of Jesus' authority? Doesn't the Master have the vision to immerse and understand our hearts? Saying, isn't the Master wiser in his designs? If he's acting in this seemingly detached, seemingly distant way that they observed in this Palm Sunday entrance in Jerusalem, and in this peacemaking way without engaging with the powerful and the politics, isn't there a reason for that? And then he says something very beautiful here for us to remember. The habits, which is the tunics, the attires, the garment of the clergy, and the robes of the Roman dignitaries are just garments for the earth. The teachings of the Master are from heaven, and it would be a sacrilege to mix its purity with the corrupted organizations of this world. What a powerful teaching that James was already understanding in the first 2-3 years of Christianity, mixing the purity of the message of Jesus that comes from heaven with the corrupted organizations of this world. And he continues, after all, we cannot be wiser or more loving than Jesus. He knows the best path and the best opportunity for the conversion of humankind. Success in this world is full of traps for the spirit, and among them it's possible that we become transformed into some outrageous version of the truth that the Master represents, or we become a source of scandal, an instrument for scandal. So James very wisely wants to instill in his friend Judas a sense of patience, discernment. Take a deep breath, Judas. Relax. Trust in the designs, even though you may not understand them or agree with them. In this moment, trust. But Judas is still very distressed. And the scene here ends with the two of them continuing to walk in this road. And Emmanuel says, the light of the firmament, the last sun rays were hitting the distant clouds while the two disciples took different paths. And something that I really love about Humberto de Campos' narrative and the content that he brought to us, to the world, through the mediumship of Chico, is a non-judgmental, compassionate narrative of Judas. Because what he says next is very beautiful. He says the following: in spite of James's loving advice, I'm skipping. We're gonna get to that. He's going to describe a little bit of Judas's inner state and how he truly loved the Master. But we'll continue for now with the lecture. So they finished walking in this path, and Judas goes home. And Humberto says, despite the advice from James, Judas spent the entire night overcome with distressing concerns. And now Humberto narrates the dialogue that Judas was having with himself. And he said, wouldn't it be better to accelerate the triumph of Christianity in this world? Didn't Israel await a Messiah who would take all the power into his hands? And that's true. The tradition at the time was that the Hebrew people were waiting for a Messiah who was going to be a general and be the head, the commander-in-chief of the Israelite military, so to speak, and be able to overcome the world and take it by force. That was the vision that they believed and cultivated for a Messiah. So when Christ comes in this personality of Jesus, it's a Messiah that is misunderstood by the majority. A few here and there within the rich and powerful understood, including Nicodemus, who was a very wise, very influential doctor of the law, and he understood, he could tell. But still, he was immersed in this corrupted organization of the world, which was really hard to maintain the spiritual priorities over the material priorities, right? So Judas continues this inner dialogue by trying to rationalize his intentions. And he says, by making use of the Messiah's doctrine, he could take into his hands the reins of the movement of renewal, while Jesus, through his goodness and humility, would be remembered as the living symbol of the new idea. So he almost wanted to have Jesus be the artist who goes out into the stage and does the beautiful demonstrations, but he would be the manager, the executor of the entire affair. He felt like Jesus wasn't qualified with those skills that he felt he had and had the ability to do as a merchant, as a businessman that he was. So as he was listening to the conversations, he was reliving in his mind the different conversations with the authorities of the Sanhedrin. He began to execute his plans in his mind. And the next day, he wakes up drunk with illusory dreams. And Umberto says he would turn the master in to those in power in exchange for his official nomination to direct the activity of his companions. So he was asking for an endorsement, an official endorsement from those in power to be named the leader of this movement, so that his apostles and Jesus himself would be able to listen to him for the future advice on how to proceed strategically with the message of the gospel, not within the common people, but with the rich and powerful. And Umberto continues to show us the thought process of Judas, that Judas would have the authority and the political privileges. He would satisfy his ambitions, seemingly just, with the objective of organizing the Christian victory among his people. After he attained the high position he was counting on, he would then free Jesus and use his spiritual gifts to convert his prestigious friends and protectors. So in his mind, once he was granted that powerful position, then he would free Jesus and ask Jesus, okay, we're going to have now an appearance in the wealthy house by King Herod's son. Jesus, come on, we'll go there, we'll have dinner, and then you perform your gifts, you perform your miracles so that everyone there can believe, can be converted. Then next day, we're going to go to the house of Joanna of Cusa's husband, and his friends are going to have a banquet there for you. I'm going to organize everything, bring all the rich and powerful from the neighboring towns. Then, when I give the cue to you, you go there to the stage and you start using your spiritual gifts and heal people. So he meant well, except that it's not that easy, as we know, right, friends? If we just stick to the phenomena, it's not really what converts our hearts to the gospel, ultimately. And Umberto concludes by saying that in Judas's view, the master was too humble and generous to win alone against the wickedness and violence of the world. So he almost wanted to be a protector of Jesus in the world. So, as the next day happens, he goes to the Sanhedrin and does what his mind was wanting to do, make the agreements. He received the petty gratification, which was the 30 silver coins, which appear in the gospel, and crazed by his ambitions. Oh, and this is where I was mentioning about Humberto de Campos. Jesus loved the Messiah, and he waited anxiously for the moment of triumph that would give him the joy of Christian victory through human political maneuvers. Now, this is very central to the takeaway here of this chapter. Umberto is saying that despite this illusion of the apostle to want to tread the corrupted organizations of the world to bring the heavenly message in its heart, he loved the Messiah, and he was really awaiting the Christian victory, the joy of Christian victory, in order to be able to free Jesus and then continue the message. So things don't turn out the way he was planning. And Umberto says the price of vanity, however, lay in wait for his excessive ambition. So the excessive ambition connected to that impatience, and even connected to what Leo read for us in the beginning of tonight's broadcast from the book Happy Life, acting from the heart but using reason and balancing in moderation these two very powerful forces we have in us, right, friends? The heart, the feelings, the emotions, the reasoning, the intellect, always be able to do a perfect chemistry of movement so that they can act together in a wise and loving way. So as things turn out, the master was humiliated, was mocked, and was taken to the cross of shame, vilified and flogged. Now, Judas was not expecting this outcome. And despite everything that happened in that crucifixion Friday, Jesus never protested, never complained. All he had was utmost forgiveness and mercy for his executioners. So as Judas is observing this unfold before his eyes, which was contradicting everything that he had assumed was going to happen, and he had agreed with the powerful people, he goes to Caiaphas and talks to Caiaphas, demanding the fulfillment of his promises. But the clergyman, listening to his words, smiled with sarcasm. He appealed. Then Judas goes out to other prestigious friends and tries to get a intervention for this to stop. And Umberto says he had to recognize at that moment the fallibility of human promises. Tormented and distressed, Judas searched for his companions in faith. So he goes to the apostles and he finds them beaten down and humiliated. And it seemed that he could recognize the same painful and silent disapproval in each one of their gazes to him. So in a similar way that Jesus never protested when he was being crucified, the apostles emulated this gospel-like attitude of being peace-loving and peacemakers by not really expressing rebelliousness, but just a silent and painful state of lament at the circumstances that they were observing, that they were powerless to stop, right? And this is what happens. And in the end, from far away, Judas is contemplating everything, and terrible remorse afflicts his torn conscience, and passionate tears, they stream down from his sad and deadened eyes. In spite of the vanity to which he became lost, Umberto said he deeply loved the Messiah. So you see that he was doing the best he could. He was really striving to use all of his talents and his abilities to get the Messiah's message out to the people that he believed would have the means and the power and the access to speed up the message of the gospel on planet Earth and convert people's hearts and minds. So of course, because this doesn't plan out the way it happens, he goes into that fig tree, a sinister fig tree, and he hangs himself. And as Umberto says, the last things that he hears were the consoling and unforgettable voice of the Master, penetrating the deepest part of his soul. I am the way of the truth and of the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. The sounds of New York in the background are so soothing. Yes, there's sirens and a lot of noise. New York is alive and well despite everything, right? Nice comment. So we are left in this passage of the book Good News, realizing what happened, but getting a better understanding that this was not really the plans that Judah had in mind. And in contrast to his reaction to what he was seeing was happening, we see the reaction of a woman like Mary Magdalene, for example, which we're going to examine very soon as part of this Judas conversation. This is a scene that happens also on the week of the crucifixion in the town of Bethany, the town of Bethany, in which Mary, by that point, already could feel in her intuition. She could already tell that the Master was going to be crucified. He was going to be killed. It was just a matter of time. And rather than reacting in this external way that Judas does, anxiously wanting to change the course of things, overriding the wisdom of the Master and wanting to take matters into his own hands, Mary does a completely different approach, the opposite approach. And in a very moving scene, she takes a very expensive ointment, which is a fragrant ointment, which cost 300 denarii or monies at the time, and she pours it all over the body of Jesus, which at the time represented an embalming ceremony, an embalming ritual, which is something that was done when people were preparing a dead body to be buried. And Judas watches this scene and he gets outraged. He was the one that controlled the money purse of the apostles, so he was in charge of the finances as they were walking in different areas. And he says this could have been, this very expensive fragrance that was just wasted here could have been given to the poor or sold so we could help the poor. And Jesus turns and says, well, this woman actually did to me a very great service. And wherever in the world and whenever in the world this gospel message is proclaimed, her name will be present. So this is the heart approach as opposed to the cold intellect only approach. This is the one of deep resignation and understanding, of peaceful acceptance of the outcome, and the very sacred preparation of Jesus' body for what was to come. There are scholars like Carlos Torres Pastorino, who is an amazing scholar who contributed incredibly to Spiritism, who even says that the herbs that were part of the ingredients of this ointment were numbing, were like almost like an anesthesia type of herb, which would have helped energetically and to soothe the pains that Jesus would experience a few days later during the crucifixion. So we see here a very beautiful scene of that becoming the lowest, meaning removing the ego, removing the vanity, and reaching out with that heartfelt purity, just from the bottom of the heart with no fear, coming to the level of the person's needs, empathizing with the person, which is the core of the message, right? So what happens then when Judas hangs himself? So this is sort of the next chapter to the story that, thanks to Spiritism, we are able to broaden our vision in such a beautiful way. Chico Xavier also channeled a book through psychography in 1968, which I'm pulling it up here, called Coração e Vida, or Heart and Life in Portuguese, Heart and Life in English. And it's a series of poems that were written by a poet, a female poet by the name of Maria Dolores. She was from the northeastern part of Brazil. And in one of these poems, there's one called Love and Forgiveness, which takes place exactly in this scene here of Sunday, the Sunday of Resurrection, where Jesus appears for the first time, materialized to Mary Magdalene. So He was the treasurer. Thank you, Hercules. That's correct. Good to have you here, my friend. So, this poem shows us something that's very beautiful that I often wondered. The spirit of Jesus, the minute he expires on the cross on Friday evening, where does he go? Between Friday evening and Sunday morning. What is he doing? This poem gives it a little bit of an insight. And after we see the poem, we'll have a therapeutic moment of introspection with a little music that we'll play for you. So the poem goes like this. It's called Love and Forgiveness. Magdalene went to the lovely tomb among stones of harsh discomfort. She was bringing flowers for the deceased master with a painful, wounded heart. The sun was just reappearing, luminous. The morning fog melted in the air by the golden flames invading from the rising sun. Mary was there in solitude and wanted to remain so, isolated, to weep. As she burst into tears, she says to herself, "Why, Lord? So much longing, so much pain. All the happiness that I felt lies buried here. It's transformed my life into shadow and nothingness in the desert of this final place." Then she saw someone. Was he a gardener, a caretaker of that sanctified place? But with astonishment, she saw herself in front of the Master of Nazareth, the supreme benefactor resurrected, enveloping with peace her tired heart. She yelled, "Lord!" He said, "Mary." She was the expression of perfect happiness, he of perfect love. Magdalene kneeled, wanting to kiss his feet. "Mary, because of who you are," he explained, "don't touch me, because I wasn't waiting for you here in this place, and I have not been to the Father to clothe myself with light." Mary, surprised, asked, "Lord, where have you been? In which celestial garden have you found the necessary rest that comes from God as a gift of total peace?" A quick break here, friends, in this. There's a very cool insight that I never understood until I read this poem. Jesus tells to Mary, as Mary is about to touch him, he tells her, "Mary, don't touch me because of who you are, because I have not yet clothed myself with light, and I haven't been to the Father." In my mind, and I heard this being described was basically Jesus was saying, because of you being a sinful woman, I can't have you touch me. And that always puzzled me. I never really understood that. When we continue to read this poem, we're going to get a different perspective of this. But for now, let's keep in mind the concept that Jesus has not yet gone up to the Father, to higher spheres, to clothe himself with light. And that's one of the reasons he asks her not to touch him yet. So then she asks, surprised, "Lord, where have you been? In which celestial garden have you found the necessary rest that comes from God, a gift of total peace?" Forgive me, Master, for my improper questions, but it hurts me to think about the pain you went through in the Calvary. I get upset, I suffer, I can't overcome the pain of remembering your immense sacrifice. But then he answers to her, "No, Mary, I haven't been to the celestial realms. I haven't even risen an inch towards the light of heaven. Whoever loves cannot find heaven in a quick leap. Instead of riding upwards, I descended, but I went down, deep down to the lower realms. Awakening from the tomb, I heard cries of distress." What's happening here with my thing? Oh, here we go. "Awakening from the tomb, I heard cries of distress of someone I loved so much and whom I still love. Even though I could see the most beautiful light above, I felt this person was a beloved fellow in crisis of sadness and madness. I went to the abysmal shadows for this great search, and finding him embittered and insane to the point of not recognizing me anymore, I spent a long time caressing and cradling him, and little by little I finally managed to get him to fall asleep. Lord, asked Magdalene, who is this friend that made you descend before seeking our Father's light? Then he says, Jesus replies with a serene and clear voice, Mary, a friend never forgets the pain of a friend that falls. Look how beautiful. A friend never forgets the pain of a friend that falls. Before raising myself to the celestial happiness, to the Son of the same love that to God that you raised yourself in, I used the long silent hours to go down to the darkness in order to relieve the immense pain of Judas. It's such a wonderful realization that the Christ of the planet continues to serve selflessly even after enduring such a intense sacrifice on the cross. His spirit continues, and the love of friendship, the community, as he says in another part of the gospel, my disciples will be recognized by how much they love one another. So the friendship of community, the ties of friendship around pure bonds, around constructive endeavors, is what unites our hearts to the hearts of Jesus. And it's not just necessarily some religious activity, some spiritual service, any worthwhile endeavor in the human arena, whatever field, if it's involving people to build something good, something useful, it that energy of community, of purity, will forge bonds with the hearts of the people involved, that they're going to be disciples of Jesus, whether they admit it out loud or not, because just by acting Christ-like is enough, right? Jesus says, if you do this to the little ones, you will be doing it to me. So it's this fusion of us blending our intention of our hearts and minds with the one of Jesus, right? So I wanted to meditate for us in this moment using music, so we can go deep inside of our souls in this for the next minute and see ourselves, watch this scene of Jesus cradling, nestling, caressing like a baby, like a young, fragile, vulnerable child, the spirit of Judas, who was being eaten by the remorse of his conscience at having realized that his plans did not go according to what he wanted to, and he was so desperate with affliction and remorse that he commits that act of suicide. And Christ comes and just sits there with Judas for 2 days, from Friday evening until Sunday, in order to soothe his soul, to appease his heart, calm his mind, until he's able to fall asleep and begin his process of renewal as he's being rescued. So I'm going to play a melody that the title of this melody is called Now We Are Free. And I hope that the music brings us takes us to that scene of Jesus there caressing Judas between Friday and Sunday. Okay. For those that have watched the movie Gladiator, this is part of the soundtrack from the movie, and it's a beautiful melody. And I like that the title is "Now We Are Free." Says a lot about the story of Judas in this moment, right? Okay. Well, the beauty is we continue to go forward in the future and observe the saga of this spirit and what are the next chapters in his life. And I'm going to pull up the other narrative, which is this one right here, the interview with Judas. So in Humberto de Campos, in another book called Chronicles from the Beyond the Grave, actually meets the spirit of Judas. And this is in the year 1935. So it's been almost 2,000 years. And here we find some incredible insights that Humberto gives us about his chat with Judas. So he actually finds Judas in the Jerusalem of the time. So in the spirit realm, he explains that we are able to travel to different regions in the spirit world, but also to visit back in time areas on earth in the past. And so he wanted to go and experience the scene of Jerusalem at the time of Jesus. And who does he find there? He meets Judas. He's sitting there by a rock. And he says, a captivating man was sitting on a rock. And someone whispers into Humberto's ears, do you know who this is? This is Judas. And he says, Judas. And then this voice, which Humberto doesn't identify who it is, says, it's like a guide, says, yes, the spirits sometimes appreciate, despite the progress that they have already made, to go back, visit places where they were enlarged, expanded, or they were evaded, feeling momentarily transported to those times gone by. Then they plunge, they immerse their thoughts into the past, returning to the present, ready for the necessary heroism for the future. And he says Judas usually comes to the earth on those days when the Passion of our Lord is celebrated, to meditate on the acts of long ago. So Humberto describes the spiritual presence of Judas, and he says, the man's figure magnetized me. He says, I'm not yet free from the reporter's curiosity, but between my sinfulness and the perfection of Judas, there was a huge abyss. My boldness, however, and his holy humility of his heart joined together so that we can listen to him. So he was so taken aback by the superiority, the beautiful presence, the magnetic presence of that spirit, that he was a little bit hesitant to go and approach him. But he noticed that emanated such a humility, such a purity in that man's heart that gave him the encouragement to approach. So he approaches and he asks, are you, in fact, the son of Iscariot? And he responds, yes, I am Judas, replied, saying in a sad way he was wiping a tear from his long robe. He says, I sometimes contemplate this ruined Jerusalem here, meditating on the judgment of transient men. Then Humberto says, is everything that the New Testament says about your personality in the tragedy of Jesus true? And then he starts to describe what we see in Good News. He said, partly. The scribes who wrote the gospel didn't take into account the circumstances and the political tricks that ruled over my actions in the crucifixions. And he explains that Pontius Pilate and the Tetrarch of Galilee, in addition to their individual interests in the matter, they were also in charge of safeguarding the interests of Rome and the Sanhedrin. And then he says it's always the same thing, these two big forces. Rome wanted the kingdom of the earth, while the Sanhedrin, the doctors of the law, wanted the kingdom of heaven, fighting with iron and fire for Jehovah. And he says Jesus was in the middle among these two antagonistic forces with his purity. And he said, I was one of the people who were deeply passionate about the master's ideas, but my excessive zeal for doctrine made me sacrifice its founder. Above the hearts, I saw politics as the only weapon with which I could triumph. And Jesus would gain no victory. So he admitted that he was more interested or focused in the politics of it than the hearts. He says with his theories, he would never be able to win the reins of power, since he felt possessed by a horror of property. So he didn't have no interest in possessions and powers and the wealth of the world, since that's all transitory. He said, I planned a silent revolt similar to the coups that are projected on the heads of state on the earth. And he said that in his plan, the master would move to a secondary level and he would find collaborators for a vast and energetic, powerful work. And then he says, like the one that Constantine the Great did, the emperor, after defeating Maxentius in the gates of Rome, which he himself admits only served to distort Christianity. So he's narrating to Umberto the layers that were not registered in the gospel about the backstage of what was happening. And he's also at the same time admitting that other people after him, like Constantine the Great, wanted to do the exact same thing, became victims of the same illusion of vanity, thirst for power, for position, and took a heavenly message and wanted to make it part of the establishment and by force. And it only, he says, only served to distort Christianity. So he says, when I surrendered the master to Caiaphas, I didn't think that things were going to reach such an unfortunate end. And overwhelmed by the remorse, I assumed that the suicide was the only way to redeem myself in his eyes. So now Umberto begins to dig. He says, did you redeem yourself? Did you save yourself by the repentance then? He says, no, I didn't make it. And he says something very powerful here. Remorse is a primary force for repair work. When we come to our senses with remorse, it's a primary lever that propels us to do repair work, to roll up our sleeves, dust ourselves off, and go at it to repair. He says, after my tragic death, I immersed myself in centuries of atoning suffering for my act. And he begins to reveal his incarnations. I suffered horrors in the persecutions inflicted in Rome on adherents of the doctrine of Jesus. And my trials culminated in an inquisitional bonfire where I was imitating the master at that incarnation. And I was betrayed, sold, and usurped. Victim of felony and betrayal, I left the earth, the last remnants of my crime in the 15th century Europe. And since that day when I surrendered for Christ's sake to all the torments and infamies that demeaned me, with resignation and compassion for my executioners, I closed the cycle of my painful reincarnations on the earth. And I felt in my forehead the kiss of forgiveness from my own conscience. Wow. We see that he was right afterwards reincarnating in those heroic experiences of martyrs, which are thousands of individuals whose faith bore witness to something so transcendent and powerful that they were able to surrender their lives in these public spectacles in the arenas of Rome. And the people that were watching were moved. Some were haunted. Some were disturbed by it. But all of them left questioning, what moves these people? What causes them to rejoice, to sing, to pray? They were haunted by those scenes. They had never seen anything like that before. And the spirit of Judas was amongst those heroes of the beginning of Christianity as the process of expiating from the remorse he felt in his conscience. So it culminates in this 15th century Europe, so many, many centuries later. And what's really, really interesting is that when we look at the story of Joan of Arc, we see, thanks to these revelations, that she and Judas were the same spirit in different reincarnations. And if you have never watched the story of the movie of Joan of Arc, I recommend this one, friends, that I put here, which is available on Netflix. And it is, first of all, it's a great movie to watch by itself. Action, great production, amazing scenes. But when you watch, understanding that this woman was Judas, and you see the things that Joan of Arc endured, it is incredible. You see how the law of cause and effect happens. She was sold, she was betrayed. Every single thing that Jesus endured because of the actions of Judas, Joan of Arc endured herself. And as he says to Umberto here in this narrative, mimicking the master. He was emulating the master, and he was emanating the same forgiveness, the same love, the same compassion for all of those involved in the story. So he says something so beautiful here. I closed the cycle of painful reincarnations on the earth, and he felt in his forehead the kiss of forgiveness of his own conscience. So it's the conscience, it's our conscience that is going to be there reminding us when we have not yet paid until the last cent, according to the words of Jesus in the gospel. It is us. We have that knowledge, we have that wisdom. And so it took Judas this entire period of 15 incarnations to redeem himself, to liberate himself, set himself free from the turmoil of that experience, and took Judas to an incredibly elevated state, because he now dwells in a place that is much more elevated than planet Earth. He is in the same place with Jesus, helping. And what's very beautiful is that there are many centers in Brazil, Spiritist centers, that are actually called Judas Iscariot Spiritist Center. So for us, as a society, as a humanity in the year 2020, to be able to reframe this character who, up to this day, receives these public condemnations and ceremonies and rituals on Passion Friday, to a man who made a mistake but was able to redeem himself by repairing it, by atoning, by being able to rebuild, is a completely different, it's a change. And we are able to then connect with our hearts with this spirit who undoubtedly can help us here in our own journeys of obedience, betrayal, faithfulness, in our conscience, right? So I wanted to, as we wrap up, show this moment here of the manger, since we are approaching Christmas and it is a time of celebration, it's a time of gathering around this manger, this community, and to celebrate the inner Christ in us and give it more room to be born, to grow strong. And we know that when we allow this to happen, we can see in this scene how the animals in us tend to become a little more domesticated, more appeased. We are able to then allow these animals to work with us and for us, and not be enslaving us through our exaggerated behaviors that we know we've done in previous lives. And so let us allow this inner Christ to thrive in us in this new moment as we enter a new year, very tough year that we all endured. Let's still look at the gospel message with this joy, with this friendship with people, and be able to do what Judas did. Be able to set ourselves free so that we can boldly reach for bigger, brighter, more beautiful horizons when we are able to accept and appease our hearts with our minds and be able to work with our community, do what we are called to do every day here. I wanted to now bring you guys a quick little video that is something that I took from a song from 1969, a group named The Fifth Dimension, a song called The Age of Aquarius, and a little refrain that they say, "Let the sun shine in, let the sun shine in," and allow this very upbeat music to really light a fire inside of us of joy, of enthusiasm, of optimism, and renewed hope for the new year, because Jesus is on this boat with us as we are rowing through the seas of our life. Jesus is there at the helm of the ship, guiding us to beautiful horizons tomorrow. All we need is our goodwill, to renew our goodwill every day so that we can be of service when we are called to be of service. So I'm going to just share the screen for this song, and then we are opening to questions from anyone who wants to share their thoughts with us. And if you want to dance and if you want to sing along, to let the music come in, it's the message to end today, to let the sun shine in. I just want to make sure that you guys can hear. I don't know if you'll be able to hear. Well, yeah, I don't think you'll be able to hear. I just realized that. Yeah, friends, apologies. The song is not going to work. I don't have it set up with sound. Okay. That's it. Apologies.
No problem, Fred. If you want to send it to us, we'll share with our community, everyone. That will be a great thing. But we would like to thank you for this amazing experience that you brought to us. I call it experience because it's the renewing understanding or idea about our dear friend who had so much passion, who had so much love and so much energy, right? And I wanted to make so many questions, but as a host, I would like just to go ahead and acknowledge everyone else. Acknowledge you, obviously, bringing this to us, and and bringing again music into our lives, into this moment. So thank you for everything and for this amazing study. It's sure something that we can expand in other talks as well, because there's so much to learn with these feelings. As I believe Kirsten mentioned today too, in one of her comments, it's us, right? It's so alive in our day-to-day lives. So this figure and these teachings. So I want to say welcome to everyone. I want to give our heartfelt welcome to all of those who are connected with us, who say their hellos, and their welcomes. And but I want to dive in directly into the questions and comments that will be relevant to us to even dive into these teachings. I would like to start. There is actually a question. I don't know what this is, but Karina Dewey wrote, "What happened to the study of Leon Denis' arts?" But I'll leave it at that. Maybe it's something that she was mentioning to you.
Well, we finished the book, Karina, the Spiritism in the Arts, and then the pandemic came and we were not able to continue the study in person, and frankly we got distracted with other things that we never continued. But I do miss those studies around the Leon Denis book. I think they're still available on Kardec Radio. Thank you.
So it was more an inside thing. We clarified. Awesome.
Yeah.
And then we move on to Yasko. Hi, Fred. I am understanding that Judas was trying to get from the high priest of Sanhedrin authority.
Yeah, he wanted a position of authority, Yasko, from the Sanhedrin. He wanted the chancela, the endorsement of the Sanhedrin, to be the middleman between the Sanhedrin authorities and Jesus and his apostles. He wanted to be that guy that was negotiating and being the diplomat, the politician between those two things, so that he could convince the apostles to go to the rich and powerful, and he could convince the rich and powerful to welcome Jesus and the apostles. That was essentially what he wanted to do.
Great clarification. Thank you. And then Kirsten comes and says, we all sometimes have a little Judas within us, don't we? We think we know best. Instead, we need to connect with Jesus, and trust in God. And trust the process instead of stressing. Easier said than done, I know. I don't know if you want to make any comments.
I think that the spirits in the spirits book say that after Kardec asks, okay, I understand that pride and selfishness are the two biggest obstacles to our progress, but give me something more here, spirits. What else do I need here? And the spirits respond, well, a ancient Greek sage once said, know thyself. And I say this because when we begin this journey of knowing ourselves more, we find certain truths that are inherent in our hearts and our conscience. And sometimes we may have to betray the tribe we belong, the community we are in, the society that we are a part of, the nation, the political party, the affiliations that our current personality is identified with, for the sake of this inner truth that we've discovered in a very sacred and divine process of self-discovery. And in order to enact this inner truth, which is a Christ-like truth for us. And sometimes they call this transgression. Sometimes we need to transgress in order to transcend. Sometimes to obey is to betray ourselves. So sometimes we will do something to please other people, but if we are not there with our hearts and our minds, we're going to be betraying the person, the situation, and ourselves. Is why Jesus says, let your speech be yes, yes, no, no. Clear, true to your inner truth, sincere to yourself. And by saying this, I'm not suggesting you're being selfish or you're being more or less altruistic. No, you're being faithful to what it is what is our inner truth. And when we align ourselves with that, we can be more reliable, more faithful to be of service to Jesus. And so I believe that Judas was following his inner truth, which was his inner truth at the time, but he comes to discover later on that the methods that he used to get to that were wrong. And that's why the name of the chapter is The Illusion of the Apostle. So for us, I think it's important to maintain humility and always ask for feedback and advice from those that we love and that we trust, so that we can always put our perspectives, our perceptions in perspective, so that we make sure this is part of, I think, being vigilant and making sure that others are seeing us in a light that corresponds with our inner truth. But let's not make the mistake of just blindly doing something or following something or someone just because I want to please others or because I feel identified to a tribe, a community. There's a movie I would like to recommend. It's not a Spiritist movie, but it's by this rabbi called Nilton Bonder, called The Immoral Soul, or Our Immoral Soul. It's on YouTube for free, and there are English subtitles. And it's a very deep psychological study of the Bible, the Old and the New Testaments. And he interviews people all over the world who are considered transgressors, who had to break from tradition, who had to break from the norms of society in order to pursue a higher calling with themselves. They were successful at it, and because they broke free, they were able to build bridges for others to then cross. But they did that with a lot of personal sacrifice and a lot of attacks from others who didn't understand at the time what they were trying to do. So it's a wonderful study as it connects to this message of Judas about what's a real betrayal versus what's an illusion of betrayal, right?
Thank you, Fred. To give continuation, this is going to be kind of I would say hard to understand. He actually does not know what he was asking. Maybe we can ask for clarification, but I'll throw it out there. Orlando Gray said, "What of pre-incarnate Judas and his future earthly mission? Like, did Jesus, the spirit world, think was a good idea? And then he said, I don't know what I'm asking, but maybe you do. I think it has to do with perhaps the future and his future reincarnation. So
What I understand, Orlando, and I'll try to respond here, is we know that no spirit comes to planet Earth to fail. There is no reincarnatory plan that is orchestrated and arranged for that spirit to become a scandal, a source of scandal, someone who's going to cause and wreak havoc. This makes absolutely no sense, right? So it's not that Judas was sort of in charged with the task to be the source of scandal and cause the crucifixion of Jesus, but that he carried the tendencies within him, which would very likely align him energetically with spirits who wanted to cause this scandal on the earth and use that man as the instrument, the incarnated instrument to carry that out. Could it have been another apostle? It could have. If an apostle had the same affinity of thoughts, motivations, and emotions like Judas, maybe it would have been somebody else, right? What made Judas be the person that did that was that he was so blinded by the love that he had for the gospel, but under the illusion that he was going to be able to shove a gospel down the throat of the rich and powerful in the way he thought possible, that what Humberto describes, it was his vanity, his thirst for ambition, his thirst for power, that caused him to be blinded to what was actually supposed to happen, which James in the story was seeing, which Mary Magdalene was seeing, right? I don't know if that answered the question or made it even more complicated. But.
no, very well, and I think that it's good that you mentioned this and you bring this, because I believe it also answers this question that Alba brings to us. According with traditional Christianity, it seems like Judah was predestined to betray Jesus in order to fulfill the scriptures. Spiritism does not believe in predestination. How to explain it? So yeah, it's very valid that it's not something that again, the spirit came with that mission to do something wrong. It was just
Exactly.
the energy that was misapplied or put into the wrong area, right? If you will.
Yeah, and I think if we look back, and when we look at the end of the story of him sealing his reincarnation cycle as Joan of Arc and doing an amazing service for France in that mission that she came as Joan of Arc, liberating France, and in the process ascending and rising above the reincarnations of the earth, liberating himself completely from that. I think that, as he says, remorse is a primary force for repair work. So the positive side of his journey that I think is worthwhile for us to meditate on is his courage. He wasn't afraid to carry out something. And I think we are all invited to experiment with our free will and use courage as the gift here that Jesus says in the book Jesus in the Home, the forgotten gift, to go out into the world and experiment with our free will. Even when we know we might fall, we might get hurt, but you know what? If we have enough faith, we know we're not going to be lost forever. We know we're not going to be completely abandoned. So as we go and do our movements, we will experiment with our free will and realize only by doing what is right and what is wrong. As Paul says, everything is permitted for you. Not everything is convenient. Not everything is recommended for your spirit, but everything is permitted. So from that positive aspect, I think Judas gains tremendous insights and wisdom and propels him into an entire direction of the next many reincarnations that are going to help his spirit to ascend much faster as a result of the actions that he did. That could be one point of view.
Perfect. Thank you. We're gonna try to squeeze two more in here. The continuation here with the questions. Yasko says, "Hi Fred. So did Judas, trying to get from the high priest from the Sanhedrin authorization to set the new parallel religion in which Judas would be the commander with Jesus become the spiritual master? He was not that illusion to replace the Mosaic doctrine by Jesus' teachings, right?"
That's, I think that's exactly what he wanted to do, Yasku. Be the boss, be the official earthly designated agent for the message of Jesus. And Jesus would be the spiritual emissary, the guy that did the miracles, that comforted, that healed, that preached. He did all of that. But Judas would be the one, the earthly authority recognized by the powerful people on the earth as the guy who was the boss of this new movement. That's how I understand him. And yes, by doing that, he wanted the gospel message to change people the way it changed him, because he really had pure intentions. He was with the apostles for 3 years, but always having that desire in his mind to, how can I bring this message to the rich and powerful, to the famous, to the wealthy, not just to the poor, the common folk here.
Very interesting. Thank you. Next, I would like to share Daniel's question. Great talk, Fred. I was wondering how this detailed information about Judas could serve as a warning for us when we have good intentions, but our actions only yield negative consequences, right?
They say the road to hell is paved with good intentions, right? And that's why Jesus says, judge not, lest ye be judged. And thus, with the same measure that we measure others, we're going to be measured in the same extent. So the more worried about judging the actions of others, the more our own conscience is going to reflect back to our own actions. So the intention is something that only God knows, that only our inner Christ knows the true intention. And that's why the consequences are always based on the intention there, not necessarily just the action. If the intention was good, but it carried negative consequences, the intention was good. The negative consequences I will have to respond for depending on the circumstances and have to repair them. But the intention, if it's worthwhile, if it's noble, if it's pure, that's what brings peace to our conscience. That's what allows us to stay in harmony with ourselves, right? That's how I see it.
Perfect. Thank you. It is an amazing topic to digest and to really reflect, because at the end, as you brought the picture of Judas, right? Reflecting about going back to that moment and reflecting about the whole situation, and it is very valid to us. And you brought a very interesting point in that picture, is that a reminder that these spirits, these high minds now, they do such a thing to receive the encouragement to what is to come, not to dive or to delay or to I don't want to say delay or to waste time on what has happened, but to say, look, this is all the tragic that I have caused. I don't want to do this anymore. I want to actually, help others so they don't, fall into the same temptation. So that was an amazing reminder to all of us, because most of the time we forget that we have to dive within ourselves, look back and say, no, I'm not going to fall in the same pit again. I may do other things because we're not perfect. But I think that, on that note, I would like to thank you for everyone here, because there are no more questions, mainly comments, saying thank you for you to bring the music as well, connecting us with this amazing a moment that we can close this. Well, I shouldn't say close, but near closing.
I love Paula's comment.
Yes.
I'm gonna look into this. Very good. Thank you for this information, Paula. I didn't know Bob Dylan talked about Judas. That's really cool.
Yep. And
And I'll send you also, Leo. There's not only this recommendation of this film on YouTube, but there's also a Brazilian musical called Alabê de Jerusalém, which is a story of Jesus told through the perspective of a preto velho, which is an old Afro-Brazilian spirit guide in the tradition of Umbanda. And there's a very beautiful scene in that musical of Mary, the mother of Jesus, singing with the mother of Judas about the loss of their children. And they have a duet where they sing and lament that their children are gone. They used to play together. It is so moving to see the two mothers mourning the loss of their children. It brings the compassion for Judas in the same intention that we had here tonight.
amazing. Please share so we can share
Will
with
do.
everyone. On this note, because of time, I would like to ask you to please say our final prayer. And we leave at that, and wishing everyone a wonderful weekend, and really reflect on this message. And thank you again. And you will be escalated soon again to come and visit us
Thank
online,
you.
or hopefully, why not say physically as well.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Leo. It's a pleasure. It's an honor for me to
Thank
be
you.
here. I feel part of the community in my heart and want to hug all of you, friends. Thank you so much. So do I do the closing prayer now?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Go ahead.
All right. So I just want to allow all of us at the Spiritist Society of Baltimore to connect with all the spirit guides that have so lovingly, so carefully been preparing the meetings of the Spiritist Society of Baltimore throughout this year, who have helped the directors, the coordinators, the workers, the attendees to adapt to the online format, who have been comforting, who have been enlightening, and have been protecting each and every attendee and member of SS Baltimore throughout this year of 2020. And to be able to be here with you, friends, and to feel all of the love and all of the peace and all the spiritual assistance that is so present here in your midst. It is truly wonderful to feel the Spirit of Christ in our midst, and that every one of your homes, as well as in my home, may be blessed with light, with harmony, with beauty in this holiday season of Christmas, that we can emanate the spiritual health, the spiritual joy, and the spiritual hope for a beautiful year of 2021 for all of us, and that we may have the courage, the determination, and the goodwill to continue to act from our inner truth and be of service in the noblest ways we can to ourselves, to our fellow man, to our friends, to our community. And may we enter this year more and more united with each other in our hearts and in our minds. Thank you so much, dear Jesus, for this moment. Thank you so much, Judas, Mary Magdalene, and all of the apostles who are also spirit guides who are here with us. Thank you very much.